The two frontrunners for the federal Liberal leadership are Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland. Chrystia Freeland has played a significant part of the existing Liberal Party since 2015. As Deputy Prime Minister, she could be considered as having been Justin Trudeau's closest cabinet member. Although not officially part of the current Liberal government, Mark Carney has been advisor to both the current government for several years as well as previous Canadian governments on financial matters. He has also held the position of Governor of the Bank of Canada 2008 to 2013 and the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. Through his advisor role, he has been attributed for much of the climate policy in Canada, the United Kingdom, and other countries. He pushed the Net Zero Initiative very strongly in these jurisdictions. He was also the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, which he resigned from in January of 2025. Both front contenders have stated that they will remove the consumer carbon tax based on its unpopularity. The difference is that Mark Carney says that the carbon tax was just misunderstood and then it was working. However, many economists and even the Parliamentary Budget Officer have found that when the indirect costs of the carbon tax are considered, it makes the cost of living more expensive for Canadians. As of early February 2025, Chrystia Freeland has not given any indication that she would replace the carbon tax with another similar tax. Mark Carney would like to replace the consumer carbon tax with a tax on industry, such as utilities. He states that this industry cost would not be passed down to the consumer. It is unclear as to how he arrives at this conclusion. Here is a clip of him from CPAC announcing the industry tax, but without any specific details. He says that the current tax has been misrepresented.
Said, what we'll do is create a system of incentives to reward Canadians for making greener choices. So it means that you'll no longer have to pay more to fuel your car or heat your home. But when you choose an energy efficient appliance or an electric car or home insulation, you will be rewarded and we will get the big polluters to pay for it.
Most consumers are on board with the incentives, but it's been many years since you could even buy an energy inefficient appliance. Wherever there is any substantial increase in cost to business, it is almost always passed down to consumers. The consumer may not pay a direct cost, but ultimately they pay the increased cost. He states that adding carbon taxes to businesses will not result in higher costs to fill your car or heat your homes. How is this possible when the companies are charged an additional tax? It increases their overall costs. It's absurd to think that they would be able to absorb this cost without cutting wages or dismissing employees. Here is another clip from the same event where he states the costs won't be passed down. He seems to suggest that when one business has an additional carbon tax and produces a product that is purchased by a second company, the companies will absorb all the carbon tax costs. This just doesn't happen in the real world.
Polluters pay. How are you going to ensure that those big polluters don't pass on the costs to hardworking Canadians, as you say?
Well, you've got to look at what the big polluters are producing versus where that's consumed. So I'm DeFasco. I'm a steel company. I'm not passing on my costs down through to the level of the consumption product.
For example, when a food commodity such as coffee or oranges increases due to shortages, usually due to bad weather in the regions where they're grown, you see a large price increase at supermarkets. So with this industry carbon tax, instead of seeing an energy charge and a carbon tax on your heating bill, for example, you may see one energy charge that is equivalent to the current energy charge plus the carbon tax charge. Currently, electric vehicles are not an option for most people due to the expense. Carney has also stated that he wants to increase the overall amount of carbon taxes which would now fall on business. This would result in even higher heating and gasoline prices and prices for several products, including groceries. Saying the costs won't increase at all is a huge deception. Every transition, big or small, has a cost associated with it. He continues by stating that the reason he is abandoning the carbon tax is that it has become divisive, not because it was not working. He states that it's just perception that there are negative impacts of the carbon tax. When I look at my heating bill and $68 out of $205 is carbon tax and GST on the carbon tax, about 1/3, I guess that it's just an illusion and the cost doesn't exist. Let's watch this next clip.
Certainly colleagues would know and people would know, it has become very divisive for Canadians. It's the perceptions of the impact, the negative impacts of the carbon tax on households without fully recognizing the positive impacts of the rebate has made this more of a divisive issue. It's been fed by misinformation and lies, quite frankly, by the leader of the opposition, but okay.
He says the negative impacts of the carbon tax are fed by the lies of Pierre Poilievre and that Canadians don't realize the positive aspect of the carbon tax rebate. Is he referring to paying $1,100 in carbon tax on a variety of products and services in a year due to direct and indirect costs and getting back $650 in rebates? Simple math dictates that consumers are paying more than they receive in return, in this case by $450. Carney tries to frame the rebates as a net positive for consumers. According to the Canadian Trucking Alliance, the carbon tax is costing them an additional $2 billion per year. This cost could double with carbon tax increases. Obviously, those costs are passed down to the consumer. Here's another clip later on in his speech.
And then we as a government will take the emission reductions, those credits, and we will let them be sold into the output-based pricing system market, which has a credit system. And that's how the large producers pay for it. We can structure this so that there's no cost to the taxpayer.
No cost to the taxpayer. Whether it is a direct cost, called a carbon tax, or an increased cost of the product itself, it's still an additional cost. In the latter case, it's also not a transparent cost. Consumers should be able to see the breakdown of the costs of a product or service and impose taxes. Once again, trying to deceive Canadians to the true cost of the carbon tax. Come on, let's at least be honest about the cost of the transition to an economy driven by green energy. So maybe it's not Pierre Poilievre who's lying. In addition, Mark Carney wants to put a second carbon tax on goods imported from countries that do not have a satisfactory policy addressing carbon emissions. In the next clip, he's continuing to talk about the new industry carbon tax and finishes with this misleading titled Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism announcement.
There's ways that that ensures that it doesn't come back down, in part because the nature of the polluters are there, and the fact that we integrate this with a carbon border adjustment mechanism.
At first, I didn't know what this meant, but I found online that this equates to a border tax. In reality, this would basically be a tariff on goods entering Canada from nations without an adequate carbon tax that at least is equivalent to Canada's level of taxation. This would be most countries including the United States, China, and probably Mexico. It is almost a certainty that these countries would retaliate with tariffs of their own on goods imported from Canada. This would make Canadian goods more expensive in these countries and decrease the total amount of goods they purchase. This would put some small and medium-sized businesses out of business. Some of these businesses sell most of their goods abroad and would not be able to survive large reductions in foreign purchases. This wording is similar to what other Liberal politicians tried to do by calling the consumer carbon tax a carbon levy. They insist that Canada does not have a consumer carbon tax. He states that this will increase growth in Canada. Once again, it's unclear as to how he has arrived at this conclusion. Higher costs of products reduce economic growth. For example, if you place a 10% tariff on oranges, if a consumer purchases $5 worth of oranges, they will now cost $5.50. For any businesses that rely on inputs from countries without a carbon tax, such as the United States, the tax will be applied to their supplies. For example, if a business manufactures an item that sells for $200 or $210 when the federal GST is applied, and relies on $100 worth of inputs from the United States, the cost of the inputs will rise to $110, assuming a 10% tariff. The business will likely now sell this product for $210, The consumer will now pay $221 when GST is factored in. It'll be even higher if there is a provincial sales tax applied. How would this lead to growth? By applying taxes that reduce individuals' disposable income and reduce the profit of businesses, logically it would result in negative pressure on economic growth. Simply, there is less money available for purchases. Businesses will have less money to invest back into their businesses. This includes less investment in new, more energy-efficient equipment and processes. Canada already spends much less on business investments in research and development per person relative to the United States. Individuals will have less to spend on necessities like groceries and less to spend on energy-efficient improvements in their household. Ironically, Mark Carney says that he wants to increase economic growth in Canada. However, this proposed carbon tax and tariff policy would take Canada in the opposite direction. His environmental policies are largely a continuation of what we have experienced in Canada the past several years. It would make products and services even more expensive than they are today.